Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Your living room? Your bedroom? Maybe during your commute? And what time is it where you are? Here's the thing. No matter where you are or what time it is, I bet you're being seen right now. Your screen sees you. This story sees you. But Valeria Anderson? She worked for 2 years in a billionaire's penthouse and was never truly seen until everything fell apart. If you believe that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter who they work for, no matter how much money they make, hit that subscribe button right now. Because just like Cooper Walker thought he could ignore Valeria without consequences, algorithms think they can ignore this channel without you. Prove them wrong. Subscribe, like. And let's show that stories about real dignity and justice matter. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Let's see how far this message of respect travels around the world. Now, let's begin. What Valeria Anderson missed most wasn't the money. She'd never had much of that anyway. It wasn't even the respect, though God knows she'd earned it after 53 years of living. What she missed most was being treated like a human being. She entered Cooper Walker's penthouse at 6:47 a.m., just as the first pale light crept across Manhattan's skyline. Her keys jingled softly as she locked the door behind her. The blinds, she went to them first, pulling them to exactly half open, the way he liked them. Not too much light, not too little. Just enough to remind him he owned a view worth millions. The citrus cleaning spray stayed in her bag. He hated citrus, said it gave him headaches, though Valeria suspected he just needed something to complain about. She used the unscented kind instead, the one that cost $3 more and came out of her own pocket, because he never thought to reimburse her for such details. The coffee? French press. 6 minutes exactly. She'd timed it down to the second over 2 years of working here. The water had to be 200 degrees, not boiling. He'd made that clear after throwing out her first attempt and making her watch him pour it down the sink. The grounds had to be coarse. The press had to be slow, steady, reverent, as if she were handling something sacred instead of just his morning caffeine. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Heavy, purposeful, the sound of a man who'd never had to tiptoe around anyone in his life. Cooper Walker entered the kitchen and threw his $12,000 coat across the marble counter. Valeria caught it reflexively, years of catching other people's carelessness built into her reflexes now. "You're late again," he said without looking at her. She glanced at the clock. 6:52 a.m. She'd arrived at 6:47. "Good morning, Mr. Walker," she said softly, handing him his coffee. He took it without acknowledgement, without thanks, without even the briefest glance that might suggest he saw her as something other than a piece of furniture that occasionally moved. But Valeria had learned to see what people didn't want others to notice. She saw the exhaustion in the way he gripped that coffee cup. She saw the loneliness in how he stood by those floor-to-ceiling windows every morning, staring at a city full of people while being utterly alone. She saw the cruelty for what it was, not strength, but the desperate armor of a man who'd forgotten how to be vulnerable. She moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. Wipe down the counters, straighten the pillows, remove any evidence that a human being lived here, because Cooper Walker didn't want to be reminded that he was human. As she worked, her phone buzzed. A text from Adrian. "Morning, Mom. Judge Hartley wants me to sit in on a major case today. Civil rights violation. I'll tell you about it tonight. Love you." Valeria smiled, the first real smile of her morning. Her son. Her brilliant, beautiful son who'd somehow risen from their tiny apartment in Queens to a clerkship under one of the most respected federal judges in New York. She whispered to herself, a habit she'd developed over years of working in silence. "Someone should see you, too, Valeria." But nobody did. Not yet. Valeria had raised Adrian alone. His father had left when Adrian was 3. deciding that fatherhood was too heavy a burden for a man with dreams bigger than responsibility. She'd never remarried, never even dated. Every ounce of energy, every moment, every dollar had gone into one purpose: giving her son a chance. She'd worked 3 jobs for 10 years, night shifts at the hospital as a cleaner, weekend work at a grocery store, and houses, always houses, cleaning the spaces of people who never quite saw her face. Law school had nearly broken them both. The debt felt insurmountable, a mountain of numbers that made Valeria wake up at 3 a.m. with her heart racing. But Adrian had earned scholarships, worked part-time, studied until his eyes burned, and somehow, he'd made it through. Now, he was finishing his clerkship under Judge Margaret Hartley, a woman legendary for her brilliance and her intolerance for injustice. Adrian called his mother every single night, no matter how late, no matter how exhausted. One day, he'd told her just last week, "You won't have to bow to anyone, Mom. One day people will see what I see." Valeria had laughed it off, tucking the phone against her shoulder while she folded laundry in their small apartment. "I don't need people to see me, baby. I just need you to be happy." But she'd never expected that one day would arrive so violently, so suddenly, in the pristine penthouse of a billionaire who thought he was untouchable. Cooper Walker was 40 years old and had built an empire by the time most men were still figuring out their careers. Real estate, tech investments, venture capital. He had the Midas touch, people said. Everything he touched turned to gold. What they didn't say, what they didn't know, was that gold was cold. He stood at his windows every morning, looking at the city spread beneath him like a kingdom, and felt nothing. No joy, no pride, just the hollow satisfaction of winning a game nobody else knew they were playing. He'd learned early that trust was a liability. His father had taught him that when he'd embezzled from his own company, blaming Cooper's mother, destroying her reputation, before drinking himself to death. His first business partner had taught him that when she'd stolen his ideas and started a competing firm. His ex-wife had taught him that when she'd married him for his money and left him the moment she'd secured her settlement. So, Cooper had built walls, high ones, impenetrable ones. He surrounded himself with lawyers, accountants, assistants, and housekeepers, all of them useful, none of them close. He paid them well enough that they wouldn't steal, he thought, and kept them distant enough that they couldn't hurt him. Valeria Anderson was just another cog in that machine. A woman who showed up, cleaned his space, and disappeared. He didn't know her last name, didn't know she had a son. Didn't know anything except that she was usually quiet and usually competent, and that was all he required. Sometimes, late at night, standing at those windows, Cooper felt something trying to surface, some old memory of being human, of caring, of connecting. But he pushed it down, drowned it in scotch or work or the next acquisition. Loneliness wears many faces, Valeria had thought when she'd caught him staring at his reflection in the glass once. But Cooper Walker wore his like armor, and he wore it well. It started with something small. Something expensive, but small. Cooper couldn't find his watch. The Patek Philippe his father had left him, the only inheritance that mattered, worth $30,000 and priceless in sentiment. He'd taken it off to shower, and now it was gone. He'd checked the bathroom counter, the bedroom nightstand, his gym bag, his briefcase, gone. And there was only one person who'd been in his penthouse that morning. Cooper didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't think. People like Valeria, people who cleaned for a living, who lived paycheck to paycheck, they stole. That's what his father had told him. That's what experience had taught him. Trust no one, suspect everyone, protect what's yours. He called the police. Valeria was washing dishes when she heard the knock. 3 sharp raps that made her heart jump. She dried her hands on a towel and walked to the door, expecting a delivery, or perhaps one of Cooper's assistants. Instead, 3 police officers stood in the doorway. Tony Gardner, Edward Mills, and Jeremy Chen. She'd see their names later on the paperwork her son would file. "Ma'am, we need you to step back into the apartment," Officer Gardner said, his hand resting casually on his belt. Valeria's mouth went dry. What's this about?" Cooper appeared behind the officers, his face set in that cold, certain expression she'd come to know so well. "My watch is missing. I need you to empty your bag." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Mr. Walker, I would never—" "Your bag, now." They didn't ask for permission. They didn't need to, apparently, when a man like Cooper Walker made an accusation and a woman like Valeria Anderson had to defend herself. Officer Gardner took her purse, the worn canvas bag she'd had for 5 years, the one with the broken zipper she kept meaning to fix, and dumped it onto Cooper's marble kitchen counter. Her wallet, her keys, her reading glasses, a package of tissues, the romance novel she read on the subway, her son's graduation photo, creased and faded from being handled so often, loose change, receipts, a grocery list written on the back of an envelope, the contents of a life lived small and honest, scattered like garbage for strangers to judge. "Please," Valeria whispered, her hands trembling. "I didn't take anything. I wouldn't. I've been working here for 2 years. I've never—" Nobody was listening. Officer Mills opened her wallet, methodical and cold. He pulled out her driver's license, her library card, her insurance card, a photo of Adrian in his cap and gown. And then something else. A laminated card, official-looking, with a seal and a signature. Federal court access, legal dependent of Adrian Anderson, escort clerk to the Honorable Judge Margaret Hartley, U.S., District Court, Southern District of New York. Officer Gardner saw it first. His hand froze. He looked at Mills, then at Chen. Something passed between them. Recognition, calculation, fear. They knew that name. Everyone in law enforcement in New York knew Margaret Hartley. She was the judge who'd ended careers, who'd torn apart dirty precincts, who'd made it her life's work to hold power accountable. And Adrian Anderson was her clerk, which meant this woman, this housekeeper they'd been treating like a suspect, whose belongings they'd dumped on the counter like trash, was his mother. "Ma'am," Gardner said, his tone shifting so abruptly it was almost comical. "We're going to need to verify—" "Verify what?" The voice came from the doorway, sharp and precise. "That you just conducted an illegal search without probable cause? That you violated my mother's Fourth Amendment rights? That you exceeded your authority at the direction of a private citizen with no legal standing to authorize a search?" Adrian Anderson stood in the doorway of Cooper Walker's penthouse, still wearing his suit from court, his badge from the federal courthouse visible on his belt. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a fury that made all 3 officers take a step back. A neighbor had called Adrian, Mrs. Chen from 42B, who'd seen the police cars, and knew Valeria, who'd worried and dialed the number Valeria had given her for emergencies. Adrian had left the courthouse mid-session. Judge Hartley had practically pushed him out the door when he'd explained, and arrived to find his mother surrounded by officers, her belongings scattered, her dignity shredded. He walked into that penthouse like he owned it. "Adrian Anderson, clerk to Judge Margaret Hartley," he said, his voice steady. "That's my mother you're searching. On what grounds?" Officer Gardner cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report of a theft." "From him?" Adrian pointed at Cooper. "A private citizen with no authority to authorize a search? Did my mother consent to this search?" "The owner of the property—" "My mother isn't property, officer. She's a person with constitutional rights. Did she consent? Silence. Adrian pulled out his phone, started recording. I'll ask again. Did Valeria Anderson consent to this search? We were responding to a complaint. That's not probable cause. You know it, I know it. And more importantly, Judge Hartley will know it when I show her this footage tomorrow morning. Adrian's voice was surgical now, cutting through their excuses with precision. You conducted a search without consent, without a warrant, without reasonable suspicion, beyond the word of a man with no legal authority. You violated procedure, violated her rights, and you did it because you assumed she was powerless. The officers exchanged glances. Gardner's face had gone pale. Mills was already backing toward the door. Chen looked like he wanted to disappear into the expensive hardwood floors. Cooper finally spoke. Look, this is getting out of hand. I'm sure we can settle this. Adrian turned to him, and Cooper actually took a step back. You're just a rookie lawyer, Cooper said, but his voice had lost its certainty. You can't touch me. I have an entire legal team. I work under a federal judge known for destroying men exactly like you, Adrian said softly. Men who think their money makes them untouchable. Men who think they can humiliate people without consequence. Judge Hartley has a special file for cases like this. She calls it teaching moments. Cooper's face went from pale to gray. I'm going to give you all 10 seconds to return my mother's belongings and apologize, Adrian continued. And then I'm going to decide whether to file complaints with the Civilian Review Board, the District Attorney's Office, and the Federal Civil Rights Division. Your move. It was Officer Chen who found it. Maybe he was trying to redeem himself. Maybe he was just thorough. Either way, he'd moved to search the penthouse properly, the way they should have from the beginning, and found what everyone had been looking for. Cooper's gym bag, tucked in the corner of his walk-in closet. Chen unzipped it carefully and pulled out a towel, workout clothes, protein powder container, and there, nestled between a pair of expensive sneakers, was the Patek Philippe watch, exactly where Cooper had apparently left it yesterday after his workout. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone turned to look at Valeria. She stood by the kitchen counter, her belongings still scattered, her hands still trembling, her eyes filling with tears that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with the humiliation that could never be erased. She'd been telling the truth all along. I must have forgotten, Cooper started, but the words died in his throat. Officer Gardner looked disgusted. Mills was already heading for the door. Chen carefully placed the watch on the counter and wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Get out, Adrian said quietly to the officers. I'll be in touch. They left without another word, knowing they'd made a mistake that could end careers. Cooper stood frozen, watching the woman he'd accused, the woman he'd humiliated, the woman whose belongings still lay scattered across his counter like evidence of his own cruelty. I should, he began. Don't, Valeria said, her voice breaking. It was the first time she'd spoken since Adrian arrived. Don't say anything, Mr. Walker. Just don't. She began gathering her things with shaking hands, carefully placing each item back in her worn canvas bag. Her wallet, her keys, her son's photo, the pieces of her dignity, scattered and retrieved. Cooper watched her and something cracked inside him, something he'd kept frozen for years. Shame. Real, burning, inescapable shame. Adrian didn't wait for apologies. He moved with the precision he'd learned from Judge Hartley, swift, methodical, merciless. By the next morning, he'd filed formal complaints with 3 different agencies. The Civilian Complaint Review Board received a detailed report of the officers' conduct. The Internal Affairs Division got a full breakdown of procedural violations, and the Federal Civil Rights Division received documentation of a pattern he'd discovered. Cooper Walker had called the police on household staff before, 3 times in 2 years. Always people of color, always accusations that turned out to be baseless. The officers cooperated immediately. They gave statements, threw Cooper under the bus, claimed they'd been coerced by his wealth and insistence. They weren't wrong, but they weren't innocent either. They'd made choices. Now, they'd face consequences. But it was the corporate damage that truly unraveled Cooper's carefully constructed empire. Adrian had mentioned Judge Hartley's name deliberately. Word spread fast in New York legal circles. By afternoon, Cooper's board members were calling emergency meetings. His investors were demanding explanations. His PR team was drafting statements about regrettable misunderstandings and commitment to workplace dignity. The tabloids picked up the story. Social media exploded. A billionaire falsely accuses his housekeeper, a working mother who'd sacrificed everything for her son, now a federal clerk. The narrative was irresistible. David and Goliath, privilege and poverty, justice and humiliation. Cooper's company stock dropped 3 points in one day. His biggest client threatened to pull a $50 million contract. His reputation, that pristine, carefully cultivated image of the brilliant businessman, began to crack like ice over a thawing lake. And through it all, Valeria remained quiet, dignified, refusing interview requests, going about her life while the man who'd treated her like dirt watched his world collapse because of the woman he'd never bothered to see as human. 3 days after the incident, Cooper invited Valeria and Adrian back to the penthouse. "To talk," he'd said on the phone, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "Please, just to talk." Adrian had been ready to refuse, but Valeria had put her hand on his arm. "Let me hear what he has to say." They met at sunset, the golden light streaming through those floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the penthouse into something almost beautiful. Cooper was waiting, and for the first time since Valeria had known him, he looked small. "I want to settle this," Cooper said, pulling out papers. "Compensation, a generous amount, and an NDA to protect everyone involved. You won't have to work again, Mrs. Anderson. You'll be comfortable for life." Valeria stared at the papers, at the dollar amount that would change everything, that would erase years of struggle, that would buy her the security she'd never had. Then she looked at Cooper. "I don't want your money," she said quietly. "I want you to understand what you did." Cooper blinked. I've offered... You offered to buy my silence, to pay for your comfort, not mine." Valeria's voice was steady now, stronger than Adrian had ever heard it. "For 2 years, I worked in your home. I learned how you take your coffee. I knew when you were tired, when you were lonely, when you were hurting. I saw you, Mr. Walker. I saw you as a human being." She stepped closer, and Cooper found himself unable to look away. "But you never once saw me, not once. I was furniture to you. I was nothing. And when you lost something, you didn't think to look. You just assumed I'd stolen it because people like me steal from people like you. That's what you believed." "I made a mistake," Cooper started. "You made a choice," Adrian interrupted, his voice sharp. "You chose to see my mother as less than human. You chose to humiliate her. You chose to call the police, not because you had evidence, but because you had power, and she didn't." Adrian moved to stand beside his mother, and Cooper saw them clearly for the first time. Not a housekeeper and a clerk, but a woman who'd built something extraordinary from nothing, and a son who'd risen to defend not just her, but everyone like her. "My mother worked in your shadows for 2 years, Mr. Walker," Adrian said softly. "Now you stand in hers." Cooper looked down at his expensive shoes, at his marble floors, at the empire he'd built on the assumption that money meant he was better than others. And for the first time in his adult life, he felt small, ashamed, utterly, completely wrong. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice cracked. I'm truly, deeply sorry. You deserved better. You deserved to be seen. Valeria nodded slowly. Yes, I did. She turned to leave, Adrian following, and Cooper watched them go. Watched them walk out of his penthouse with more dignity than he'd ever possessed, despite all his money, despite all his power. The papers offering hush money lay on the counter, unsigned, worthless. The press conference happened 2 weeks later. Adrian had organized it, though he'd given his mother every chance to refuse. But Valeria had surprised him. People should know, she'd said, were not for revenge, for truth. They held it at the courthouse, Judge Hartley's subtle endorsement making it impossible for the media to ignore. Cameras flashed as Valeria sat at a long table, Adrian beside her, lawyers from the Civil Rights Division flanking them. Adrian spoke first, his voice clear and precise. My mother's case isn't unique. Every day, workers are treated as invisible. Their dignity is violated by employers who see them as disposable. Their rights are ignored because they don't have the resources to fight back. My mother was lucky. She had me. But what about everyone else? He listed them. The other housekeepers Cooper had accused. The maintenance workers fired without cause. The delivery people humiliated. The nameless, faceless army of people who kept the city running while being treated like they didn't matter. This isn't about one billionaire or one false accusation, Adrian continued. This is about a system that allows people with power to abuse people without it, assuming there will be no consequences. Then Valeria spoke. The cameras turned to her, and she felt the weight of their attention, but also the weight of everyone watching who'd been treated the same way, who'd been humiliated, dismissed, made invisible. I'm not special, she said softly. I'm just someone who loves her son and who worked hard to give him a chance. But I'm also someone who deserves basic respect, basic dignity, basic humanity. We all do. Her voice grew stronger. Mr. Walker thought he could treat me like dirt because he had money and I didn't. Because he had power and I didn't. Because in his world, people like me don't matter. She paused. But I'm here to say that we do matter. Every single person matters. And no amount of money should let you forget that. At the back of the press room, Cooper Walker stood, watching. He'd come uninvited, knowing he'd be seen, knowing he'd be judged. His PR team had begged him not to come. His lawyers had forbidden it. But he'd come anyway, because Valeria Anderson had taught him something in the weeks since that terrible morning. Sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. He didn't speak, didn't try to defend himself. He just stood there, silent and ashamed, as Valeria's words washed over him, words that would be quoted for years, words that would spark conversations, words that would change how some people saw the invisible workers in their lives. When it was over, when the cameras had stopped flashing and the reporters had rushed out to file their stories, Cooper approached slowly. Mrs. Anderson, he said quietly, I heard what you said, every word. Valeria looked at him, saw the change in his eyes, not complete, not perfect, but real. Good, she said simply. 3 months later, Valeria returned to work, not for Cooper Walker, but for herself. She'd started her own small cleaning business, treating her employees the way she wished she'd been treated, paying them fairly, seeing them as whole human beings with lives and dreams and dignity. Cooper had tried to hire her back, offering triple the salary, but she'd declined. Some bridges, once burned, were better left as ashes. But she'd seen the changes he'd implemented, new protocols for all staff, HR oversight, mandatory respect, training for executives. Small steps, imperfect steps, but steps nonetheless. He still lived alone in that penthouse, still stood at those windows staring at the city. But sometimes now he noticed the people who kept his building running, the doorman, the maintenance crew, the delivery workers. He learned their names. He said thank you. He saw them, imperfectly, but genuinely, and slowly learned that seeing others was the first step toward being fully human yourself. Adrian had taken a position at a civil rights firm, turning down more lucrative offers to do work that mattered. He took on cases for the powerless, the invisible, the people who needed someone to stand beside them the way he'd stood beside his mother. On the anniversary of that terrible morning, Valeria and Adrian had dinner at their favorite small restaurant in Queens. She'd laughed more than he'd heard in years, her face lighter, her shoulders unburdened by the weight of being invisible. "You know what I realized?" she told him over dessert. "I spent so many years just trying to survive, just trying to get you through school, that I forgot I had value too, not just as your mother, but as myself." Adrian reached across the table and took her hand. "You taught me that, Mom. You taught me that everyone has value, that everyone deserves to be seen." She smiled, and in that moment, she looked 10 years younger. "Everyone deserves to be seen," she repeated softly, like a prayer, like a promise, like the truth she'd earned the right to speak. And finally, after 53 years of being invisible, of being overlooked, of being treated like furniture in other people's lives, Valeria Anderson was seen. Not just by her son, not just by the people who'd rallied to her cause, but by herself. She saw herself clearly for the first time, not as a housekeeper, not as a mother, not as someone defined by service to others, but as a woman of courage, dignity, and profound worth. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all.